9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Last week, we presented part 2 in this three-part series. That was the Twin Towers explosive destruction. This is part 3, the Twin Towers and extreme heat, in which we'll be looking at the evidence of very high temperatures and incendiary chemical reactions involved in the destruction of these two skyscrapers. Before we go further, though, let me introduce you to our operations manager and the host of 9/11 Freefall, Andy Steele. Hey, Andy.
Hello, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in this week. Just to let everyone know that I'm here to help with any technical glitches, which will occur from time to time. Also, we'll be taking your questions at the end of the webinar today. You can submit them from our website. It's the best way to do it. Go to ae911truth.org. Go to continuing education and select the live webinars. You'll see a box to type them right in. I'll also be keeping track of the Facebook broadcast of this webinar today and the YouTube stream to see if there's any good comments or questions related to the material that Richard's presenting. So with all that said, back to you, Richard.
And thank you, Andy. Just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums, and also the construction administration for this $125 million high school. More importantly, before reaching out to people with this critically important message that we have today, working full-time on that, I had similar responsibilities working on the $400 million mixed-use project here near Las Vegas, with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. And when we do, we use something called the scientific method. You may have heard of it in 7th grade, for instance. We have a question. How did these towers come down? We do some background research. We make some observations. How have other towers come down? We construct a hypothesis. This is our best guess as to what really happened at the World Trade Center. Maybe the jet planes brought it down. Maybe it was the ensuing fires, or maybe explosions, or even controlled demolition, for which we've seen in this series already a lot of evidence, and we'll be looking at a whole lot more today. We analyze the results after testing these hypotheses with predictions, analyzing the results, drawing conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the result in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of the work that we're doing. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back. We construct a new hypothesis until we find one that is corroborated by the evidence, the testimony, the research, the data, and so forth, until we have a hypothesis that is corroborated. That's the process we're about today. And so let's do some background research, find out what are some of the forces that have destroyed buildings. A quick review for those of you who are with us last week. We found that fire is an organic process. It burns out an area in about 20 minutes, moving on, looking for fresh new fuel sources. So this is even acknowledged, by the way, by NIST, who says that such fires did not persist in any one location for more than about 20 or 30 minutes. This is actually standard knowledge in the fire engineering community. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people. tasked by Congress, and we'll see how they performed with regard to that mission today. Now, we haven't lost a steel frame skyscraper, but say wood frame buildings, which are combustible, the actual structure is combustible. In a wood frame building, we'd expect it to fall in stages, to fall over to the path of least resistance, not straight down through the tons of structure that is holding that building up and so much stronger and typically fireproofed. In fact, steel buildings are fireproofed, and that's why we've not lost one. But what might we expect in the way of behavior of steel buildings in a fire? Well, we have the largest test of its kind done in the UK in 1995. They built an 8-story building, partially out of fireproofed steel. But as you can see here, even some of the parts of this building were not fireproofed. And we have an incredible fuel load put in these buildings to try to get them to fail and see, what actually happens. Let's see what happens.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, of course, we're referring here to 9/11, when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse due to fire, which is one of the reasons we're taking an extra look at it today. NIST even acknowledges this is an inherently stable behavior in these buildings due to fire. In response to fire, due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form, not to mention the fireproofing and so forth that typically goes into these buildings. Well, let's look at a few building failures that collapse due to natural causes. In this case, earthquakes, which cause these buildings to collapse. We certainly see a damaged building, but it doesn't fall straight down through the path of greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structure underneath supporting the building. It typically falls over. The building's certainly badly damaged, but we don't have the concrete pulverized to a fine powder. We don't have the columns and beams in the building severed one from another. Okay, so these are some buildings that were exploded. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds and cauliflower-shaped forms expanding rapidly due to the incredible heat generated by the explosives. We have also witnesses that see explosions. They hear explosions. They even see flashes of light due to the explosions. If we have these features, then we know we have explosions. Now, we looked at a lot of these features in last week's series, part 2 in this 3-part series. So I encourage you to look at that free on YouTube. Just Google 9/11 An Architect's Guide, part 2. So let's see what happens with a controlled demolition, where explosions can be harnessed quite effectively to bring down buildings, like you see in this series of controlled demolitions, where shaped cutter charges are placed against the columns and beams in the building at key locations, and then set off synchronized floor by floor in a pattern to bring down these buildings, usually starting at the base of the structure, but they can start anywhere they want, as we saw last week. So there's a set of features that we noted last week that are associated with typical controlled demolitions: a sudden onset of destruction, a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint, which we saw last week, a patterned removal of column supports, free fall acceleration or near free fall acceleration, the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame is typical, limited damage to adjacent structures. That's one of the goals, certainly not achieved on 9/11, as we saw last week, because it was a very explosive event as opposed to a classic implosion, which is typical in a city context. We have the patterned explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by witnesses, broken up concrete floors, and explosive charges visible at many of the floors called squibs, which we saw last week as well. And chemical evidence of explosive devices, which we'll be looking at today. But these are direct evidence of destruction with explosives. None of them are attributable to fires, making our comparison of what is in a set of explosions versus a set of destruction by fire quite easy, actually. Fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically, but with gradual deformations following the path of least resistance. So let's look at some of those fires that have been in skyscrapers. We've not lost one, though. Well, let's look at it.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
No, none of these did, and not even, as he mentioned, World Trade Center 5, which was thoroughly engulfed. No collapse. And since 9/11, many skyscrapers fully engulfed with fire. No collapse of a steel-framed, fireproofed high-rise building. And yet these fires diminished at the time of the collapse in the World Trade Center, which were said to be the cause of the collapse. Are oxygen starved and with thick black smoke, indicating that they are indeed cooler fires, are said to have caused the collapse of this building. You can begin to see why we're taking a more critical look at this. Experts have said, we haven't had a collapse due to fire in high rises. Well, let's look at some of the reasons why not. Steel conducts that heat away from the source. It's very dense material. The conduction is relatively high of that heat away. So it never gets to its 1200 degree Fahrenheit temperature, say at the center of a beam or wherever, which can cause the beam to sag. It just doesn't happen. But just to be sure, we put 2 and 3 hour fire protection on these steel beams, allowing that fire to burn for that long, 3 hours on the columns and 2 hours on the beams. So that's 4 to 6 times the time needed because the fire, as NIST admitted, moves on after 20 or 30 minutes, looking for fresh new fuel sources. So we also require that these buildings are built out of non-combustible materials and that their content is that the tenants can bring in, and they can't bring in large fuel loads, for instance. And just to keep all that from becoming a problem, we put fire sprinklers in these buildings. So this is a triple, quadruple layer of redundancy that keeps these buildings from coming down. With additional circumstantial corroborative evidence, such as government documentation, foreknowledge of a building's collapse, experts agreeing, hey, yeah, that's a controlled demolition. At least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter of what is or isn't a controlled demolition. With video documentation, all this can be proof of controlled demolition. Proof which we're once again going to apply to the Twin Towers in this part 3 of this series. In part 2, we looked at the first 8 characteristic features of controlled demolition, found that they all met. And they're not destruction by fire, but destruction with explosives. Oh, fires didn't create those. Fires cause less robust structures to collapse, but again, they do so asymmetrically with gradual deformation following the path of least resistance. Today, we're going to launch into feature number 8, extreme temperatures. Well, the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921, the Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation, says look for thermal effects. What does they mean by that? Okay, well, how about large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases in cauliflower-shaped forms, which we see racing away in every direction from the extremely hot event of the destruction of the World Trade Center towers, expanding 10 times the volume of the building in just 30 seconds. It takes an incredible amount of energy and temperature to create this type of heat. Not created by these fires, which were surely extinguished just in the mechanical collapse of the building. No, something else is going on here, which we're looking at today. Something on the order of this, perhaps. So let's look at it. Let's start with the extreme heat evidenced in the Massimo Mazzucco's 9/11 New Pearl Harbor, a video which he's made, which is available in our store, by the way, in a 5 DVD series at ae911truth.org. Let's take a look.
Possibly the most important unexplained phenomenon at Ground Zero are the extremely high temperatures registered under the rubble for many weeks after the collapses. On September 16, NASA shot these thermographic images of Ground Zero, indicating unusually high temperatures at the base of the 3 collapsed buildings. Despite the heavy rains of September 14th, the hotspots registered peak temperatures of more than 1,300 degrees under the rubble. 10 days later, the fires kept burning.
What's to explain, Governor, the smoke that still comes out? There's still fire down below. There is such an incredibly deep pile of rubble, and the tower goes down. 5-6 stories underground.
But we had ABC crews come back just in the last few minutes and telling us there are still flames coming out of the base of the trade towers.
For the rescue workers, this became an additional burden on their already gruesome task.
Out still on the rubble, it's still, I believe, 1,100 degrees. The guy's boots just melt within a few hours.
On October 8th, the hotspots under the 3 collapsed buildings remained clearly visible. 6 weeks later, as the excavations progressed, the situation seemed only to get worse.
Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was a board at some point, and it looked like an oven. You know, it was just roaring inside. It was just a bright reddish orange color.
The consequences of such extreme temperatures were quite visible on the steel that was being extracted from the rubble.
Where the grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames, which was pretty spooky to see.
You would create an air pocket by moving steel, fueling the fires underground. But, you know, these underground fires were just like the fires of hell.
If you could make a video of what you perceive hell to look like, from fire shooting up at times, that's what would happen. You would be in the middle of what would look like steel, and then fire just would pop up. Firemen were coming out and ironworkers with their boots literally melted. And then the hose would come over and they would try to put that part out.
I got there.
Charlie Vichers was a supervisor of removal operations at Ground Zero. From PBS's America Rebuilds page, we read, Vichers' crew picked up 40 to 60 foot long pieces of steel impaled in the pile, where the bottom 20 feet would be glowing red hot. Vichers said, trucks loaded with steel would pass by, and you could feel the back of your neck burning standing 20 feet away. In an article called A Dangerous Work Site, the U.S. Department of Labor wrote, underground fires burned at temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This was confirmed by Mayor Giuliani.
There were fires of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit below the ground.
The Journal of the American Society of Safety Engineers wrote, thermal measurements taken by helicopter each day showed underground temperatures ranging from 400 to more than 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. 8 weeks later, and the fires still had not subsided.
You see how this debris is still smoking? That's from the fires that are still burning. 8 weeks later, we still got fires burning. So, I mean, these things are burning. At one point, I think they were about 2,800 degrees.
11 weeks later, and the fires kept burning.
As recently as the end of November, it was still 1,100 degrees down underneath the rubble.
As November turned into December, ice was noticed in the mornings above the ground, but the debris underneath was still smoldering.
The weird thing was it was very cold when we were up there. I believe it was in the middle of the winter, but the ground wasn't frozen. The ground kind of like bubbled underneath your feet, which was kind of strange to me.
It took until December 19, more than 3 months after the collapses, for the last underground fire to be extinguished.
Indeed, this is real curious because we have even structural engineers coming to the site, like David Scott from Arup Associates. Red hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile, completely not understanding that fire or kerosene, as we'll see, doesn't turn steel red hot. Office fires don't. It was dripping from the molten steel, so they don't melt it either. Saw pools of literally molten steel at the World Trade Center, says the president of the cleanup company. Seeing the molten steel, uncovering red hot metal beams, ranging from molten metal, which was still red hot weeks after the events. Molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains. Streams of molten metal that leaked from the hot cores and flowed down. Metal dripping from a beam, says this firefighter. Molten steel beams. The end of the beam would be dripping molten steel. Mark Loiseau, president of another cleanup contract recipient from Controlled Demolition Inc., says molten steel was encountered primarily during excavation of debris. There are videotape and photos of the molten steel being dipped out by the buckets of the excavators. A little river of steel flowing, says Leslie Robertson, the structural engineer for the World Trade Center, and his associate, Richard Garlock, who says the debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running, like you see pouring out of the South Tower 10 minutes prior to its collapse. NIST says, oh, this must be molten aluminum from the airplanes. Well, molten aluminum is silvery in daylight conditions, like you see here. It doesn't glow bright yellow or white or even orange in daylight conditions, like you see from the material pouring out of the crab claw excavator. I didn't even know concrete could melt, but here it is in the museum today in Manhattan, documenting 3,200 degree Fahrenheit temperatures. That's where concrete melts. Fire temperatures so intense that concrete melted like lava, flowing around everything in its path, including this handgun from World Trade Center 6, which is why it's in the police museum today. Steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. There's a problem here. It takes 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit to evaporate steel. What's evaporating the steel? We'll get to it. I saw melting of girders in the World Trade Center, says this distinguished professor from UC Berkeley, structural engineer Abolhassan Astani Asl, who had a National Science Foundation grant to study the steel. He says, if you remember Salvador Dali paintings, like the clocks are kind of melted. It's kind of like that. It can only happen if you get steel yellow hot or white hot, around 2,000 degrees. Well, what can cause that? Don't tell me jet fuel. We'll be coming back to that. Let's look at Massimo Mazzucco again. 9/11 New Pearl Harbor.
Another proof of extremely high temperatures reached during the collapse are the twisted and mangled steel beams found at Ground Zero.
Architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
You saw steel, some of the thickest steel I've ever seen, bent like a pretzel.
This 8-ton steel I-beam is 6 inches thick. It was selected to be preserved for future generations for the near-perfect horseshoe-like bend formed during the collapse.
I found it hard to believe that it actually bent because of the size of it and how there's no cracks in the iron. It bent without almost a single crack in it. It takes thousands of degrees to bend steel like this.
In fact, the temperature of 2,800 degrees mentioned before is not casual at all, as that's exactly the temperature at which steel melts.
Steel melting is documented as well, and much more carefully by FEMA in their Building Performance Assessment Report in Appendix C. The metallurgical examination of that steel reveals what? A 1-inch column thinned to half-inch thickness, its edges curled like a paper scroll, thinned to almost razor sharpness. How does this happen with steel? It's unprecedented. But they go further. Rapid oxidation and sulfidation with intergranular melting. Liquid iron, that's molten iron, invading the steel. Sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. Well, where does a liquid iron come from? We haven't used iron in our skyscrapers for 100 years. We'll be looking and seeing where it comes from. Where does the sulfur come from? Well, no clear explanation of the source of the sulfur has been identified. So we it's called perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, according to NIST. I mean, according to the New York Times. But this is completely ignored and omitted from the NIST report when they took over the investigation from FEMA in 2002. The presence of sulfur is very well identified, though, in the report. How can they just ignore it? And the hot sulfur corrosion attack. They say, well, gosh, sulfur is present in gypsum wallboard. Wait a minute. These gypsum partitions contain inert calcium sulfate. And in its 100-year history of protecting steel, it's never turned around and attacked the steel that it's been designed to protect for so long. The arbiter of competing hypotheses is experiment. So here's an experiment. Let's get a 2,000-degree fire. Let's put gypsum board against the steel beam. Let's see if it had any deleterious effect on the steel. No, not at all. And yet, a smell of sulfur permeated the World Trade Center. Where is it coming from? It burned. That smell of sulfur, says John Field, demolition worker. Well, let's go to John Gross, co-project leader of the NIST report, talking about NIST's perspective on this phenomena.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
But witnesses testify otherwise.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like
Like lava.
from a volcano.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
And the cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. Steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
They pulled off a big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
Are they all wrong? Or is somebody lying? Here he is, John Gross, on the pile, identifying the very piece of steel that was cut off and sent to FEMA for analysis, included in their Appendix C, metallurgical examination, in which they find the hot sulfur corrosion attack on the steel with liquid molten iron. His shadow is all over the evidence. But hydrocarbons, meaning building contents, and jet fuel also only burn 600 to 1400 degrees. According to ME Petroleum, their jet fuel only burns 600 degrees Fahrenheit in open air. And that's what we're talking about here. So how do we get temperatures exceeding 2700 degrees where steel can begin to melt? The fires are only 500 to 1400 degrees. This particular supporter of the official story says 1200 degrees. How do we get to 2700 degrees? Well, let's look at one possible suspect, thermite, which creates 4500 degree temperatures. But first, note that we can tell the temperature of molten iron and steel by its color. Here, exceeding 2500 degrees Fahrenheit to white hot, flowing out of that. So even hotter. What caused the steel to melt? Well, NIST has a speculation about this. Due to high temperature resulting from long exposure to combustion within the pile. That's their official answer. But wait a minute. The law of the conservation of energy completely is violated by this response. You can't have fires burning under pulverized concrete powder in the basements, which is a closed system. You can't have the amount of energy is fixed. You can't create more energy inside that system. The fire, in other words, can't somehow get hotter than the capacity of the fuel that is burning. It's ludicrous. You can only convert that energy you have from one form to another. In this case, the heat is dissipated, not increased. Well, let's look into it. The possibility of thermite, which is an incendiary. Incendiaries, as you'll see, destroy things by means of heat, whereas explosives, which we looked at last week, destroy things by means of concussive force. It knocks things over. Could thermite have created all this molten iron? What is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Interesting. So maybe we're getting somewhere here. We have, if thermite were used, a possible source for the extreme heat, because thermite produces 4,000 to 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit. We'd have a possible source for the elemental iron, which we're going to see was found in abundance. Because molten iron is what's emitted from sulfur. We haven't used iron in our skyscrapers, as I mentioned, for 100 years. We use steel alloys now. This is elemental iron. And we'd have the possible source for the sulfur, which is added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. So you see, it's all beginning to gel for us here. Well, NFPA 921 says, look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite or other pyrotechnic materials. It says, we found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used, omitting tests for thermite, but also admitting a year later, we didn't test for the presence of explosive residue. You can't find what you won't test for. But others did. It wasn't that difficult to find. Stephen Jones is one of them, a nuclear physicist formerly with Brigham Young University. Says that thermite reactions produce a characteristic burn pattern, a white, yellow, hot, liquid metal, like we see pouring out of the South Tower minutes before its collapse, and like all those firefighters saw in the basements. And a whitish cloud of aluminum oxide ash, like we see rising up off this molten material pouring out of the South Tower, like we see trailing these thick white smoke clouds, trailing these freely flying structural steel elements out of the World Trade Center, here about to land on World Trade Center 7. Well, wait a minute. Structural steel is not flammable under office fire conditions or even jet fuel, as we've already noted. So why are these steel beams on fire trailing these thick white smoke clouds? This looks more like a volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea with upward, outward arching streamers freely flying solid objects trailing thick white smoke clouds, geometry of fireworks. Doesn't even look like a collapse. It looks like a series of massive explosions. And both of these towers look the same. They're collapses. Didn't even know steel beams could be on fire. And
The
yet,
grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames.
are these credible witnesses? Well, Stephen Jones says the signature of thermite would leave behind chemical evidence, such as iron, aluminum, copper, calcium, silicon, which are fairly common elements, but it would also leave unusual elements like fluorine and manganese left behind in the residue. These elements on the periodic table of the elements. Well, somebody, a sculptor, doing one of these sculptures with the leftover steel, the steel that was managed to be saved, a 40-pound chunk was, a piece of this was sent to Stephen Jones for analysis. He does electron microprobe data, finding, hey, it's predominantly iron. So he can rule out aluminum from the jet planes right away. It has abundant manganese, so he can rule out structural steel also. It has abundant aluminum, sulfur, potassium. This is the residue of thermite. He says, oh my God, where in the world does the potassium and fluorine, where does it come from? Well, the manganese is from the potassium permanganate, commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite. It burns underwater, has its own source of oxygen. Fluorine is used in very special thermite charges called sol gels. So these are the fingerprint of the residue, a thermite fingerprint. Sol gels, however, would leave yet another residue, 1,3-diphenyl propane. What the heck is that? Well, the EPA analysis, whatever it is, says one molecule was present at levels that dwarfed all others. 1,3-diphenyl propane. We've never observed it in any other sampling that we've ever done. In other words, it's not from computers. It's not from typical plastics that might be in a building. So another sculptor working on this International Peace Park sculpture in Manitoba, Canada, does X-ray, sends him another piece of slag from the end of the beam. He goes, oh, interesting. Let's look at this. He does X-ray fluorescence and showing what? Potassium, manganese, aluminum, sulfur, iron, classic ingredients of thermite. Well, you can do your own experiments with shaped cutter charge in your backyard, like John Cole, civil engineer, did. Made his own shaped cutter charges, blowing the hell out of these
The web was
steel
reduced in thickness with gaping holes, thinned to almost
materials.
razor sharpness, with a Swiss cheese appearance.
Wait a minute. Thin to almost razor sharpness. Where did we see that before? Oh, yeah. In the FEMA Appendix C, metallurgical examination of the steel with a hot sulfur corrosion attack and liquid molten iron invading the steel. Well, guess what? You can make your own invention. This was patented prior to 9/11, and it's a thermite-based apparatus for cutting steel of much greater thicknesses using molten iron with thermite. Cuts through in hundreds of milliseconds. It's actually much more effective than high energy explosives like C4 and RDX. But it would leave quite a signature that's different. In other words, in a deceptive controlled demolition, they might not want the high audio signature of a loud bang and the visual signature of the bright flashes associated with high energy explosives, C4, RDX. So they might, for that reason, have wanted to go to something different. Less of a bang, less of a flash. But as we saw last week, people still heard bangs and flashes. There are even devices patented again prior to 9/11 whose casings are made of consumable consolidated thermite. Nothing left behind except molten iron, which we've seen abundant evidence of already. But what else was found in the fine powder, mostly concrete? 30% of this powder is concrete from river to river. We saw that last week. The U.S. Geological Survey finds billions of previously molten iron microspheres in the World Trade Center dust. Almost naked to the human eye, but some of them are up to 1/16 of an inch. And they're identified as being molten iron, elemental iron. Huge percentage, relatively. 6% of the dust is composed of these molten iron microspheres, amounting to up to 4 tons by extrapolation altogether. This is 150 times the background level of typical iron found in house dust, for instance, or office dust. But those are not spherical. What we're looking at is spherical particles. There we go. So R.J. Lee does an investigation. They're an environmental consulting firm, very well known throughout the U.S. They said these are formed during the event, not before, by the iron workers building, the welders building the Trade Center towers, not after, by the iron workers cutting the Trade Center apart in the aftermath, but during the event. There's so many of these spheres that they're used as a signature component to determine what is World Trade Center dust versus what is other dust. Well, how would you create these iron spheres? Well, here's an experiment with thermite, a very small controlled experiment. With this much producing or slowing it down halfway, thousands of sparks. Look like sparks, but they're molten iron microspheres. They cool and fall. You see, molten or aerosolized liquids like molten iron could be in an explosive environment. They form themselves into spheres because of the surface tension. That's just what liquid does. When you sneeze, for instance, same thing. Could that be what could explain the toasting of the tops of these cars parked in and around the World Trade Center towers? Not in, but around. In this extremely high heat event. Well, what else was found in all that World Trade Center dust? We have a team of 8 international scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen. They're given samples 7 altogether, independently collected, like the ones from Jeanette McKinley's apartment here. And she paid for that decision with her life, succumbing to brain cancer after working with that dust in her artwork for years afterward in an attempt to try to heal the extremely traumatic event that she had gone through that morning. Well, all of the samples have the same red-gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other. They thought they were paint, but they are attracted to a magnet, indicating a high iron content. The largest is about a 16th of an inch long. They get real curious. They zoom into the red layer, do analysis on it, X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy. What do they find? Aluminum, iron, the ingredients of thermite. What's thermite doing in the World Trade Center dust? Well, they get awfully curious and zoom in 50,000 times with an electron microscope, and they find what? Particles of iron oxide crystals and aluminum platelets that are 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. Very uniform particles. Nano-sized particles. This is nanotechnology. They find that they're in a matrix of oxygen, silica, carbon. This is organic material which is responsible for the expansion in TNT, for instance, high energy explosives that use organic material to expand and knock things over. Oh, they get real curious and do some research, finding that, gosh, the research on this super thermite, it's called in official circles, which is put out prior to 9/11 research info, peer-reviewed papers and so forth. They find that in a heater, a differential scanning calorimeter, these super thermites ignite. And so they tried it. And yeah, all their samples ignited at about 758 Fahrenheit. But when they ignite, they produce what? Molten iron microspheres with the same chemical signature as the molten iron microspheres found by so many others in the World Trade Center dust. So you see, we know where these molten iron microspheres came from. They came from these paint chips. As if we didn't know. They're found attached to these partially ignited red-gray chips, as you see here and here. So you see, this is a set of experimental data that is internally consistent, repeatable. It can be brought to a court of law to put the real perpetrators of the 9/11 catastrophe in jail for mass murder and treason. This material is not made in a cave in Afghanistan. It is extremely sophisticated, made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. This is all documented in a 25-page peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. You can read it today. Just Google active unreacted thermitic material in the World Trade Center dust. It's a highly energetic and pyrotechnic or explosive material. It proves how the World Trade Center towers were brought down. It's direct evidence, all of the evidence we've been looking at today, of destruction with explosives. No evidence of destruction from fire in any of the evidence we've been looking at today. Again, especially these fires, diminished at the time of the collapse, indicated by the thick black smoke. Even the thermal imaging videos show temperatures less than 200 degrees in these videos. And surely those would have been extinguished during the collapse itself. So what do the experts say? Well, let's look at some of the experts, some of the 100 experts, structural engineers, signed on to our petition at AE 911 Truth, like Ronald Brookman, says it doesn't look anything like a heat-induced gravitational collapse mechanism. Why did the complete collapse of the Twin Towers become inevitable, as claimed by NIST? Why would all 110 stories drop straight down to the ground in 10 seconds, pulverizing the contents to dust and twisted steel? Ed Muniak, fire protection engineer, one of several signed on to the petition, says the fires were very weak. NIST reports confirmed that the steel temperatures were low. World Trade Center collapses have no resemblance to any previous high-rise fire collapse. How about and there's 100 more, so you can look at those on our website at ae911truth.org. All their statements are right there. Surely the evidence was preserved in what was easily the largest and most unexpected collapses. And unprecedented. Well, let's listen to one structural engineer, Abolhassan Astani Azam.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
The evidence of the steel went to the melting pot, to China, for recycling, before investigators could get their hands on it and do a proper forensic examination. Even the mayor of New York, Mike Bloomberg, who is an engineering major, has the audacity to say, just looking at a piece of steel metal generally doesn't tell you anything. We have computers these days. This is outrageous. All of this prompting Bill Manning, Fire Engineering Magazine editor, to cry out crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. And easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history. We have 400 truckloads a day of steel sent and put on these barges. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene. But what have we seen today through our use of the scientific method? Did we show that jet planes brought these towers down? Or the ensuing fires? Or like last week, explosions? This week, incendiaries in a controlled demolition. Altogether, between last week and this week, we're showing direct evidence of destruction with explosives, incendiaries today. No evidence of destruction from fires in any of these features, let alone all of them. With additional circumstantial corroborative evidence that we've shown in part 2 and 3 of this series, we're talking about proof of controlled demolition with incendiaries, which has prompted more than 3,000 architects and engineers, 25,000 years of collective experience, to declare that we need a new investigation. That's why we want to involve you and see if you have any questions. So, Andy, how can people ask their questions here?
So the way you ask your question, best way is go to ae911truth.org, select continuing education, and then click the live webinars. You'll see the box right there. Get them in. And in the meantime, right now, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if now that you're informed, you agree this evidence is compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Awesome. And there's the form that you can use where Andy said. And while you're there, sign up for our email newsletter. It's a series of bulletins that we send out, letting you know the latest evidence that we've gotten together, the latest efforts and success we're having toward getting a real investigation. And get informed. We have an incredible evidence site on our website. So lots of videos, lots of reports, really important stuff. Sign the petition there, even if you're not one of our architects and engineers. If you are, we definitely need you to sign. But if you are another, well, you can also support those architects and engineers. We have 20,000 others signed on to the petition. And please, if you can donate to our cause, we have 6 employees who work full-time trying to get this information out. But sometimes we don't even get paid because we don't have enough support yet. We're building our support base, which is why we have an opportunity for you to join the family of sustaining supporters, monthly sustaining supporters at AE911 Truth, to keep us going out, giving the presentations all around the country to architects and engineers, to media professionals and elected officials as well. If you can't do any of that, at least volunteer. Andy, what are some of the opportunities we have here?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, while you were doing the webinar, I was coming up with a list of projects that are going to need to be tackled in the next few months. And I think they're going to be, I don't want to say fun. There's nothing fun about the subject, but in terms of research and looking up things, definitely something that'll be very interesting and probably very captivating. Maybe that's not the right word, but something that people are going to want to be involved in. So the first step is go to ae911truth.org. There's a volunteer form on there. You fill it out. We'll get you on the phone and see how best you'll fit in. And there's different kinds of projects for different types of personalities, whether it involves calling people on the phone, looking up information right now. If you're a translator, you can speak another language. We certainly have a place for you there. Verifications team, helping out with our political outreach. There's different ways that you can fit in. And if you're willing to work, then you'll be a huge asset to us. So please consider doing that.
Yeah, please. And there's things you can do on your own. You can call for a new investigation, reaching out to your own elected representatives. Let them know that there's 3,000 architects and engineers, and send them the link. Get an appointment with them so that we can go and speak to them with you. You make the appointment. Let us know when it is. We'll be there to talk to your elected representative. So don't forget that opportunity. And you can talk to your television, radio, newspaper, your local media, whoever you can find. Tell everybody, every architect and engineer you know in your community or can find. Screen the DVDs with them and your colleagues and so forth. Share the brochures that we have. You can get 100 brochures for like $10 and pass them all around. Pass it around the final report of the World Trade Center 7 study by Professor Leroy Halsey of the University of Alaska, who did a detailed finite element analysis challenging, first they sought to find out, okay, is this real? Building 7 conclusion by NIST, did it really come down by fire? What's their conclusion? Fire did not cause the collapse of World Trade Center 7. It was a global collapse caused by the near simultaneous failure of all its columns. Now, that's an extraordinary finding in a 4-year study by university. And we give you more detail about this in part 1 of this 3-part series, which is specifically on World Trade Center 7. We've mailed 75,000 postcards, one to every engineer in the country. That's our goal. And we're still working on getting all of them. There's like almost 1 million of them. And we have also had a detailed conference, which you can now look up on YouTube, Justice Rising, AE 9/11 Truth. We had 3 days of incredible speakers, including family member Matt Campbell, whom we've recently raised $100,000 to get the best lawyer in London on the job, a coroner himself, actually, and in addition to being a lawyer. We're getting a new inquest into the cause of his brother's death, Jeff Campbell, who was murdered in the North Tower when it was demolished. So support that effort too. And know that this is one of the reasons we have 5 commissioners, all unanimously voting for a new resolution calling for a new investigation into the destruction of these towers. Awesome piece of history there. And why we're appealing the ridiculous decision of NIST to deny our 8 points of correction needed from their World Trade Center 7 report. And that's in appeal now. So stand with us on that, as well as making that appointment with your elected representative. Again, we will go. We will make the appointment. Just let us know on our website at contact us at ae911truth.org. When that appointment is, we'll go and we'll tell them about all this stuff in 15 minutes. And we're going to show them the Bobby McIlvaine Act. And Andy, what are we going to tell them about that?
Sure. As you can see, this is the path to justice for the nearly 3,000 who died on that day. I mean, for years we asked Congress to reinvestigate the destruction of these 3 buildings. And then we said, hey, let's do most of the work for them. So we wrote up the draft legislation. We just got to find a member of Congress that is willing to introduce it and do the work of getting all the other congressmen to vote for it. And there you go. It'll be endgame. It'll be the final chapter, because I have no doubt that when they actually look at this evidence, which the legislation is written in such a way so that they can't just throw out a bunch of NIST talking points and call it a day. They got to actually look into what Richard's been talking about in these 3 webinars. I have no doubt that at the end they would have to acknowledge that a new investigation is needed. But political people don't do anything unless they have a lot of pressure from their constituents. So that's where you get involved. First thing you got to do is go to ae911truth.org/justice. That way you can learn about the legislation. You can do some very simple things. You can call your congressman's office, leave them a message. They do take note of that. Also, there's a email form. You just enter in your address. It'll find your representatives and generate an email. It's already written for you to them on your behalf. And of course, doing what Richard just spoke of. That's so important, just having a phone meeting with them. And I mean, the one good thing about all the COVID stuff going on now is that the congressmen have to do all their work over the phone. And so that actually makes them a little more accessible to us. But the constituents got to reach out to them first. Otherwise, we're just a couple of guys out of their district. They want to hear from the constituents. So please consider getting involved. And if you need advice on how to do it, just write to us, info@ae911truth.org, and we'll help you out along the way. Actually, you can actually write to Congress at AE. That's our dedicated email address just for this effort, congress@ae911truth.org. You'll get it to me quicker because I'll know it's in regards to this.
Thanks, Andy.
So,
right on.
There you go.
We also have a investigation by a grand jury that is supposed to be going on. We've been promised it is, by Jeffrey Berman, the U.S. Attorney in Manhattan. We've submitted 60 exhibits of the evidence that you've heard over this 3-part series. And we've now filed a mandamus lawsuit requiring them to prove that this investigation is actually going on. And we've sued the FBI because they didn't tell Congress about the evidence that we've sent them. And Congress asked them for all the evidence that they've gotten since the 9/11 Commission report came out. but they didn't include this evidence, which we have proof that they have gotten. So we're in the middle of a series of responses to motions that have been filed. Finally, I want to show you a couple of minutes of this landmark documentary in which we've interviewed 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out the evidence that you've been looking at over this 3-part series. Take a look.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We could speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Yes, you can watch this video. It's free on YouTube, the 1-hour version, or you can get the 90-minute version at our store, which includes the psychology of the resistance to the truth about 9/11. Extraordinary piece by 6 psychologists around the country. And it also includes extended interviews with each of those 40 and more. So be sure to check that out at our store, AE911 Truth. Also free on YouTube, beyondmisinformation.org. You can download the 50-page booklet, which completely undermines the NIST report and provides the real evidence. You can also get the $10 version of this booklet in our store, which is a quality production here. And also on YouTube, our classic lecture on this series, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, and the 15-minute documentary of World Trade Center 7 narrated by Ed Asner. Maybe people don't have an hour to watch a video. Here's 15 minutes. You'll get them hooked. Let's jump to questions. Andy, I'm sure we have some.
Right, we have one today, but it's a long one, so let's get into it here. It says, just wondering if you saw the story about Dr. Abolhassan Astani Azal in the New York Times. It says on his first night in New York, just by chance, there were flatbed trucks parked for 2 hours with steel from the World Trade Center on them that he could see through the window at the Tribeca Grand Hotel. He went out to study this and saw an I-beam from Building 7 that was partially vaporized and buckled by heat before it fell, and assumed the steel was headed to a place where he could study it. But the steel was on its way straight to the barges. Then, after a few days of trying to study the steel while it was parked outside his hotel, they then changed their route for these trucks. He was told the steel offered no clues to the criminal investigation, therefore it was being recycled. I found this story on Google. Any comments?
Yeah, I am not familiar with this particular story about Astani, the structural engineer professor from Berkeley, who had a National Science Foundation grant to study the steel. We showed a couple of quotes from him, just to remind you. He actually is seen looking at and studying. There's a photograph, which we showed, a piece of Building 7 steel, which has been partly evaporated, which was also seen by fire protection engineer Jonathan Barnett, who led part of the FEMA report on Building 7 and the Twin Towers. So here we have direct documentation in this story of what we've already presented today, that this gentleman was just blown away by this material. I didn't know he had seen it out of his hotel room down on the street. And that the reroute happened. I was unfamiliar with that. He was told that the steel offered no clues to the criminal investigation and therefore it was being recycled. He's going, as a structural engineer, what am I hearing? This is crazy. Now, I'd like to read that. If you wouldn't mind sending us the link to that story, I think we'd probably even do a bulletin on it, so that, or get it on our website or on Facebook at least, so that we can share that. I'm disappointed that this didn't come to my attention before, but this happens all the time. There's just so much out there, and people send us. That's how we find out about a lot of the stuff. People like you asking these great questions. Send it in.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to say, if you have that story, the person who sent in the question, send it to info@ae911truth.org, and also paste it into the question box here, just so we're getting it from two places. Just paste the link to that story, so maybe we can get it immediately, and if you have it open in front of you.
Yeah, and also, Andy, do you have any other thoughts about the specifics of the question?
I have never heard the story about him chasing down that steel and being told that it was being sent for be recycled and had no clues to offer. So I would definitely love to read that, and maybe I'll read it on my show. Who knows?
Yeah, I could see them saying that. There's nothing to see here. Move along. Oh God.
There's
So
stories like that we don't ever hear about either. You know.
Yeah. Excellent point. So we've looked at a lot of evidence today and yesterday and last week and the week before. Part 3 today, part 2 before that. And in part 2, again, we looked at the explosiveness of the Twin Towers. If you missed that, look it up for free on YouTube. And review that sudden near free fall collapse of the towers. Incredible evidence of explosions, high velocity lateral ejections of shattering the steel frame, midair pulverization of concrete. We found that 100,000 tons of steel was outside the footprint. 90,000 tons of concrete was outside the footprint. I mean, in a 3 square mile area outside the footprint. So what was crushing the building? I mean, just stop and think about it. This is more than 2/3 the weight of the building that can't possibly be included in the crushing of the building. And yet that's the whole theory put out by Zdenek Bazan of Chicago Northwestern University 2 days after 9/11 in a theoretical paper that became and remains the chief theoretical basis of NIST's column failure theory of the World Trade Center towers. It's completely bogus. We showed that last week. Week before that, we showed Building 7. We're going to come back to Building 7 in November because we're going to do it again. On Thursday, each week in November, we start with Building 7, Part 1. Then we go to Part 2. Then we go to Part 3. Then guess what? We'll do the same thing in December. So share it with your friends so they can watch it live if they'd like. We don't want to miss them. Thanks everybody for joining us, and thanks Andy for helping so much. And we'll catch you all in November. And that's November. Yeah, that'll be after the election. So have a safe election. Go out and vote. Try to make something happen out there. Okay, at least locally. All right. Thanks. Bye.